Hi, everybody. My name is Lindsay Robinson. Thank you for joining us here today. Before I begin, I'm just going to point out a little accessibility feature. If you're not aware, it's the closed captions, the bottom of your Google Meet screen. I'll let you decide if you want those on or off on your end rather than me turning it on, and it, some people do get distracted by it, others really benefit from it. So I'll let you make that decision as to what works for you, but just want to remind people that that option is there. So I am currently in the role of AT project lead with the Nova Scotia Education Common Services Bureau. If you haven't heard of the Bureau, it's kind of a little side related to the education system that can help support, again, common services. And I've been working out of the same office as Peru at EECD, so we've lots of connections back and forth, and happy to do this presentation today on creating accessible documents. So just an overview of the session today. We're going to review the meaning and the importance of accessible educational materials. Sometimes you'll see that abbreviated as AIM, AEM, and the principles of POUR, which we will talk more about when designing for accessibility to support all of our learners. And we will have the opportunity, it'll probably be a short little 5 minutes or so to practice applying some of the accessibility features that I am going to speak about to a Google Doc, so that you have the ability to try it out. And if you have any questions, that's a good time to ask them. So I wanted to start out just with this question around, an accessible document. What does this mean to you? So if you want to just take a minute to write in the chat, or you could raise your hand and I can call people out based on the order in which you raise your hand, just to let me know what do you think of when you hear accessible document. So that's something that, we hear the word accessible a lot these days. Just curious what folks think about that. So I see Alexandra has said one that can be translated. Great. While I'm waiting for people to do that, I'm also just going to share the slide deck in the chat so that you have that available to you. All right, any other thoughts on accessible documents? Maybe that's why folks are here, is to learn what they are. Lily says, user-friendly document, one that every student can use no matter what ability. Excellent. Great. Okay, well, let's dive into it and figure it out a little bit more. Before we get into the presentation, just a few things I do want to point out. I'd like using this slide in any of the presentations that I do, just to, it really connects well to this presentation, but even if it's on a topic, not related to accessibility, I like to use this just to kind of set the stage to talk about what features are available during the presentation and in Google Meet. So I mentioned closed captions already as a support for someone who may be a visual learner. I'm somebody who uses that myself. Anytime I'm watching Netflix, I always have the captions on just to support my comprehension, so I don't have to keep rewinding to hear what did that person say. But it's also great for our students in classrooms to have the option to see the words on the screen as they're listening to the presentation. Simple background with high contrast font. So we'll talk more about why that's important in presentations. I add in visual supports where possible, just to, again, to support the comprehension piece. Alt text behind images. We will talk more about what that means exactly, but there is alternate text behind all the images in this slide deck. I will provide a verbal description of slides if there's something in it that is more visual. Opportunities to ask questions. So again, verbal discussion, feel free to raise your hand at any point, use the chat box, or you can also email me if you prefer. And another thing I'll ask that if you can, and it's a tricky one to just get in the habit of doing, but if when you do raise your hand, just identify yourself when you speak. So that's beneficial for somebody who's on the call that may have low vision or visual impairment to know who it is that is speaking at that time. So we'll start out with a little bit about the why. Why are we worried about accessibility? Why do we want to make accessible documents? And ultimately, it is because equitable access to education is a human right. So we do have to make sure that all of our students can access the documents that we're either creating or sharing or both. And right now, the Accessibility Act, there are RCE and CSAP joint accessibility plans in the works. Some of you may have participated in giving some feedback around the draft plans. And those are currently the feedback is being incorporated, and we should be hearing some more final plans based from those soon. And there's also accessibility standards in education for P to 12 that will be coming. And of course, all anchored in our inclusive education policy. So I like this quote. This is from Luis Perez, who is a bit of a guru in terms of accessibility out of the US. I met him this past January at a conference. He has low vision and is an expert in all things accessibility and assistive technology. And his quote is, "It can't be equitable if it's not accessible." So that's something that I always keep in mind, when we're looking at a document, making sure that everybody can access it. So accessibility is also closely anchored with and connected with Universal Design for Learning guidelines. That is just a screenshot of it there. But what I will do is go to the website, in case you haven't seen that before. So the UDL guidelines, you'll see that referenced in our MTSS and inclusive ed policy. And the UDL guidelines really are a way to make sure that we're teaching and providing opportunities for students to learn in lots of different ways. And there are a couple specific spots in the UDL guidelines that speak to different ways that we can create materials and be aware that, not everybody takes in all information in the same way and at the same time. So just always keeping UDL in mind anytime that you're creating documents is really helpful as well. And that really connects back to this universal design cycle for learning materials. So this is out of BC, and I really like it because it kind of simplifies the process to thinking about, when you're working with students, how do you ensure that the materials you're using are accessible? So the first thing is consulting with students. And when we think about, ensuring first voice in whatever we're doing, talking to the students that you're going to be working with and finding out what are their accessibility needs. Vision is a good example of that. It's a wide spectrum. You may have some students who have certain conditions where, they can see certain things or certain colors, and they just need a little bit of tweaking or maybe things enlarged, up to students who, are blind and would need to use a screen reader. So finding out what their needs are is really important and can help you figure out what you need to do with the materials. Once you've consulted with them, then you're going to get into the creating, and that's what we'll spend most of the time today talking about. But I'll also talk a little bit about remediation. So if you have a document, something that's already created, how do you remediate it and make sure that it's going to meet student needs? We see that quite a bit as a former assistive tech specialist. That is a question I would get a lot of times. Do you have this in an accessible version or in a digital copy? And we'll talk about how to fix that if you don't have access to it. Then we'll talk a little bit about checking for accessibility. There's some free extensions and tools out there that you can use to make sure your documents are accessible. And then you're going to implement and learn from the implementation. If there's things that aren't working for students, then you would go back to the beginning and do that consultation piece. So A definition of accessible, what does that mean? I took this from the Government of Nova Scotia Accessibility Standards. So their definition is free of barriers that hinder the full and effective participation of persons with disabilities, deaf and neurodivergent persons. So we're thinking about a wide spectrum, all the people that might possibly be included in our documents. And like I think it was Alex's point, one that can be translated as well. I think for some of you in this presentation that are EAL or FAL teachers, that's a big point as well. So accessible educational materials is a term that you may hear as well. It is actually one of the options in TINET as a drop-down for an adaptation that you may see. It's one that there's maybe some confusion around for some folks. I've seen things added in there in TINET as, when I would get my assistive tech referrals, things that, it might be around like math manipulatives or something like that. So I like to talk about this one a little bit just to clarify what that means. So the definition of accessible educational materials are they're educational materials, and it could be print, it could be tech-based, but they're designed in a way that makes them usable across a wide range of learner variability. So if it's a print resource, there may be things like a QR code in it that somebody could scan that would take them to, a related video or a website, that sort of thing. If it's a digital material, then it's likely going to have lots of accessibility features built into it. Things I find are getting better and better, but there are some digital materials out there that, may not be as accessible as we would want them to be. Graphics, audio, or video. So those are all fall under accessible educational materials. And, the amount of features that you see in those things can really depend on how they were created. You'll also hear about accessible formats. So accessible formats kind of take it to the next level. And this is where we would provide things like audio or braille or large print. So these are formats that some learners may run into barriers. Even if it's considered an accessible educational material, they may need something additional to support their learning needs. So I like using this example of the Starbucks Braille and a large print menu that apparently you can ask for that. It's they can give it to you behind the cache. So digital text that meets accessibility standards would also that can be used with assistive technology is also considered an accessible format. And also a definition of assistive technology, if you're not familiar with it. So again, this is from the accessibility standards, the province of Nova Scotia. So their definition is any device, software, service, or product system, including service animals, that reduces individual barriers to accessing and engaging in all aspects of a learning community, including social, emotional, academic, and daily living activities and experiences. So it's a huge, wide range of things. And ultimately, we want to make sure that whatever materials we're creating are going to be what they call interoperable with assistive technologies. And that's where sort of the testing piece comes in, and checking to make sure that things do work before you provide them to students, or kind of, it could be a newsletter or something that you're even sending out to families, making sure that it's accessible for them in whatever format of technology they might be using. So any questions before we dive into the actual designing piece? All right. So I just want to make note of these two links because they are resources that I use all the time, great ones to bookmark, and it's their materials and their sort of guidance that have helped shape this presentation. So the first one is W3C. This is a worldwide initiative to develop web standards that apply across the globe so that people can, in whatever country you're in, you can apply these standards and people are going to be able to access materials. The other one is the AIM Center out of the US. So if you've ever heard of CAST are the folks that developed the UDL guidelines. They also have this National Center on Accessible Educational Materials, and they have a lot of really great resources on their website. I do want to just go to the W3C website for a second to show you. There's lots of great resources on here for educators or web users. But what I want to point out as well is that up in this top right corner, it does say all translations. So there's lots of materials across a lot of different languages because it is a worldwide consortium, let's say. So there's lots of materials in there in lots of different languages for folks to access. Okay, so we're going to watch a short video. So this is from that National Center on Accessible Educational Materials, and it's actually narrated by Luis Perez, the fellow that I mentioned who had the quote at the beginning. So I will play this. It's about 3 minutes long.
Welcome to Designing for Accessibility from the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials. Many of the authoring tools available to educators now include options for adding accessibility into the content creation workflow. And standards such as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines provide guidance for how to do so. However, these guidelines often include technical language that can be confusing to even veteran developers. Fortunately, a set of simpler principles, as captured by the acronym POUR, provide a better starting point. POUR stands for Perceivable, Operable, Understandable, and Robust, 4 qualities that define an accessible user experience. Perceivable content is presented in a way that it can be accessed with more than one sense. This accounts for both the needs of people with disabilities and those who are accessing the content in less than optimal environmental conditions. One example is the inclusion of closed captions and transcripts for video content. This will make the video more accessible to people who are deaf and hard of hearing. It will also make it possible for anyone to enjoy the content in loud environments where it would otherwise be inaccessible, such as while commuting on a train or a bus. Operable content in digital materials can be operated with a variety of input methods, ranging from the mouse to the keyboard and even speech commands. It also means options for navigation are provided. If the content of a digital material is marked up correctly, screen reader users can use a keyboard shortcut to bring up a list of headings. Using these headings, they can skip to the desired section without the need to listen to an entire page. Understandable content in digital materials is presented in a logical and predictable way as the user navigates through its various sections, and supports for language, such as explanations of unfamiliar terms, are included or easily accessible. Robust digital materials are compatible across platforms and work well with a range of assistive technologies. Designing digital materials according to widely supported standards will make it more likely that these materials will continue to work as intended as new delivery technologies are adopted. The 4 POUR principles apply to both teacher-created and procure educational materials, whether they are commercially acquired or open educational resources. When selecting or purchasing digital materials and technologies, use the power of the market. Call on developers and publishers to add accessibility at the source. This will ensure accessibility is built in rather than bolted on after materials have shipped, and the process of retrofitting becomes more costly and difficult. The PALM initiative can help you with language you can include in your contracts. By addressing the need for accessibility at the source with developers and publishers, you will add your voice to a national movement that seeks greater equity in education. The National Center on Accessible Educational Materials at aem.cas.org is your go-to resource for technical assistance. Together, we can develop and use learning materials that address learner variability and provide better opportunities for learning to all.
All right, so I like showing that video as a little overview to kind of set the stage of those POUR principles. So we're going to dive into what each of those things means.
Welcome to this.
All right, so what I've done for this section is a slide that kind of summarizes what each of the, the P in perceivable and what that means, and then I'll do a few slides that kind of relate back to that. So when we think about information that is perceivable, it's information presented in multiple ways. So what we need to make sure is that anytime we have images, we're adding text descriptions so that people who are using assistive technology can have that read aloud. Closed captions and transcripts. So that's in here under perceivable. I know we're going to look more at documents today, but that is an important piece to keep in mind. Having a transcript for a video is really helpful because that transcript can then be translated into different languages. So even if the video itself can't be translated or you want to be able to access it, the transcript makes that a little easier. Color contrast is important. Not using color alone for information and making your text readable and legible. So we'll get into what each of those things look like. So alternative text is information for those who can't see an image or if an image doesn't load. So for example, if you're on a slow Wi-Fi connection, if you've ever noticed, when your email opens, if it'll say like can't load images or that sort of thing, the text information is what may show up in written form if the image can't load. So it's not just used to support assistive technology, but it is actually what is searched out there by the search engines. So it is important information to add to images. It is read aloud by screen readers. And in a document, if you add alt text behind an image, it is actually read aloud by read and write. So I'll show you that when I get into some demonstration. And I was looking for an example of alt text so that you could kind of see what that means. And I found this one on Twitter the other day, and if you know me, I love dogs, and I thought this was a really cute example of alt text. So the picture is a black lab. And just to give a little bit of context, the original post on Twitter was from an owner who had taught her dog to trade her items if she was, stealing socks or things she shouldn't. And so she posted this photo, which got retweeted many times. But this user, We Rate Dogs, they added the alt text to the image. And the alt text I thought was quite cute. It says, the image description is a black lab stands proudly in a doorway holding a full roll of toilet paper in her mouth. Her tail is sticking straight up because she's very excited about what kind of deal she might get for this booty. So I thought that was a really cute example of, that really does describe that image. And that's the reason that we put that alt text in there is so that everybody can access the information that's in the image. And Twitter's an example there. You see the little alt down in the bottom left corner of the picture. And when you tap on that, that will give you that information. So when you're writing alternative text, you do want to be as concise as possible. You don't need to include words like image of a dog. It's kind of assumed that it is, except when it is relevant. So if something were like a screenshot or maybe you want the user to know that it's clip art rather than a photo, you could include that. If there's text in the image itself, you do want to provide a description. So I do see a lot of that on social media, on Twitter specifically. There'll be like a poster of advertising something that's coming up. But if you were using assistive technology or you needed support to read that, you wouldn't necessarily have access to the text that's in the photo. So that's where the alt text is really important. Then people can get that information. And always thinking about the purpose of your visual, why are you including it? And that can help you when you're writing it. For things like charts and graphs, they do recommend that you give a separate description, especially if it's kind of detailed. So this was an example of one that I found yesterday where, it might be a little complex to describe it, but this is how this user described, or the person who posted it said, colored stripes of chronologically ordered temperatures where they increase in red to show global warming temperature. So just, it only takes a couple minutes to write that. The thing about alt text too is you don't need to get hung up on all the details. It doesn't have to be absolutely, perfect, but just thinking about your audience and what you're trying to convey in that image. So also, if you have any other kind of data, just being aware that screen readers read tables one cell at a time. So it's important to make sure that it's sort of formatted in a way that it would make sense if you were listening to that being read aloud. You can use a heading row when you're creating a table to make sure that it reads that heading so that people know what is in the different columns. Using tab. And I'm going to do a demonstration of when tab is really important when we're in documents. It tells you the reading order, which is really important. Also, to avoid merging cells and just keeping tables as simple as possible. If there's something that can be written out to describe an image, that can be really helpful. So how do you add alt text? It's quite simple in a Google Doc, and this also applies in Google Slides as well. Once you've inserted an image or a drawing or a graphic, you click on the image itself, and when you right-click, you'll see alt text come up in the menu there. And you'll see this kind of box. And the best practice is actually to leave the title field blank. I've never heard a great explanation as to why, but that is the information that's out there. So you can leave that blank, but then in your description, you would write what it is. So for that image I showed on the previous slide, we would just say it's a red apple. If it had a bite out of it, you might say red apple with a bite out of it. So that's really simple to do. I tend to do it as I'm creating a slideshow or a slide and I'm adding images. I just go in and add the alt text right away. The nice thing about doing it that way is then if you copy and paste that image into another spot in your slides, that description, the alt text pastes along with it. So it's kind of helpful to do it right at the beginning. If you happen to be adding an image that is considered decorative, so something that's just there to kind of make it a little more visually appealing, but it doesn't really contribute to the meaning overall, you don't have to add alt text to that. It will just skip it. But Google Sites, for example, if you're working in Google Sites, there is a spot where you can add, there's a little spot to say that it is a decorative image, but that doesn't exist in Docs and Slides yet, which I'm not sure why, but it doesn't. So color contrast is another consideration when you're creating documents. Using high contrast colors makes it easier for everybody to read. If you're in doubt, black and white is going to provide you with great contrast. There is a extension here, or a website, the Color Contrast Checker from WebAIM. I'll just navigate to that so you can see what it looks like. I actually just used this the other day to help some folks here who were looking at some digital books to see if the contrast was sufficient. So it will allow you can get these little color codes. You may have to get like a color checker. There's some different extensions that you can do that will tell you the actual color. One called Colorzilla, it'll give you this code and you can just copy and paste the different codes in and it'll tell you the ratio. And if it's past these standards, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines standards for color contrast. So a few examples, just so that you can see some poor contrast, red on black, blue on orange, red on green can be a little difficult to read, but some sort of safe contrast examples, white on black, yellow on black, or black on orange. Another thing to be aware of is to use color effectively. So sometimes we may, color code things to mean certain things. And unless you're really clear about that, or make sure that, if somebody maybe is colorblind or just has difficulty with colors, just to be aware of how that might be interpreted, or things may not be interpreted properly. So for example, if there was an important piece of information, you might want to write out the word important, just to draw somebody's attention to that in a text-based way rather than a color-based way. Doesn't mean you can't use color to indicate those things. You just want to make sure, maybe it's a couple little stars or something like that to draw people's attention to whatever it might be. Fonts and text size is another thing I get asked about quite a bit. I usually go with what APSI recommends, and it's basically about making sure that the size and font is easy to read. So they recommend a size 12 font for the body of a text, and size 14 to 24 for headings. We will talk a bit more about headings and how you can change and adjust that. Avoiding overly decorative fonts is important. I actually learned that lesson my first year teaching when, I was making documents and adding all kinds of fun little fonts. And I had a student who, was a great self-advocate, and she came up to me and said, "I can't read this curly, swirly font that you're using. Can you just keep it simple?" So that's always kind of stuck with me throughout my career. So some that we like to suggest, some sans serif fonts. So those are ones that don't have like the little wings on the ends of letters. Arial's pretty safe. Calibri, you can see the other ones there. The last one that I wrote in, Lex and Deca, is the font that I use in this presentation, and it's one that I use through most of mine. I find it very easy to read. It's nice and clear, and I've been noticing a lot lately that it's in many different advertisements now. A lot of companies are using it on their ads. So it's kind of taken off as a popular font. It was developed with the idea to support students with dyslexia. I don't know if there's research necessarily that supports that, but folks do really find it easy to read. Text alignment and spacing is important too. We try to left align text when possible. It works better with the screen reader when it's left aligned rather than centered on a page. There may be times when something just looks better centered, but just keep that in mind based on the users that you're working with. Giving a little bit of extra line spacing is helpful too. A minimum of 1.15, 1.5 or 2 helps even more. Just gives visually, makes the page a little easier to read. I'll just stop at the end of that section and see if anybody has any questions so far. All right, keep going. So the next section in our POUR acronym for Designing for Accessibility is the O is operable. So by operable, we're really thinking about people who do use different technologies to access the information, and we want them to be able to navigate through it efficiently. So providing a clear structure with headings is really important. Descriptive links. Checking for keyboard accessibility so that somebody can navigate it without a mouse. Providing sufficient time to read content and content that flashes. Those are a little more applicable for a website, but you might be, authoring that along the same lines, and those are important things to consider. So in Google Docs, using headings and structuring your document can be really helpful as a visual guide to how a page is structured. It'll automatically create a table of contents for you, which is fabulous. So not everybody is aware of this option. So I will flip over in a second to Google Docs to show you how this works. Headings allow a screen reader to jump to different sections of the document. So, just like you might visually look at a table of contents and say, I want to flip to section 6, the headings allow a screen reader user to do that. Also making sure you're using numbers or bullets or lists when possible to avoid long sections of text that can be a little overwhelming. Again, you want to left align text. And another important point is to avoid manual formatting. So rather than, using tab to center something or move things along, using those built-in formatting and also using the structure that is built into Google Docs is really helpful. So the first link on that slide is a link to the instructions that Google has for how to do that, just as a reference for you. But I do want to show you this example structured text that I created. So in this example about animals, we're kind of working from our overall topic and breaking it down into smaller sections. So for animals, I used is a heading 1. And then underneath that, 6 types of animals. Mammals would be heading 2. And then underneath that, examples would be heading 3. So right now, in that document, when I click on the document outline, you will see, and I wrote in heading 1, that doesn't automatically show there. But you can see the outline of the document on the side and how I can just jump to the section on fish, if that's where I want to go. So under this section here, you'll see normal text, title, subtitles, and here you have your different headings. And you always want to make sure that you're kind of working from heading 1 being your overall heading and working your way down, that you're not skipping headings, because that can be confusing for a screen reader user as well. I am just going to go over to a different document that I have here to show you how to add those. So I made this little grocery list document. If I wanted to have it really organized with a table of contents, the Lindsay's grocery list, you can go in one of 2 ways. You can go under format and paragraph styles, and you'll see the headings there, or it is available just in the menu here. So under heading, I could use this as my title if I wanted to. So I'll say apply title, and you'll see that pop up here. I think deli I already added as heading 1. Produce, I'm going to add as a heading. Frozen, I'll add as another heading. And I can go down and structure my document in that way. So it's helpful for accessibility, but it is actually helpful for students just to have an understanding of it's almost like a built-in graphic organizer. I had a speech language pathologist once say how, she really wished teachers would use that built-in piece of Google Docs to really support students in their writing. The other thing we want to do is anytime we put a link to a website or another document is to make sure that any links are what they call self-describing or informative. So you may see a lot of like, click here to, go to this website or learn more. But when a screen reader reads that, it doesn't give a lot of context. So we want to add, we want to highlight the text and add in the link in that way. So when you're in a document, so I'm going to go back to my grocery list. Let's say I wanted this to link to, I don't know, say the Sobeys flyer. I can highlight the text and I can right click. And this is where I would insert the link. And I could paste in here the website, the Sobeys website, and then that's going to take me right to that. So rather than this saying, click here to go to Sobeys, I'm linking it through this way. And you'll notice that it just makes for a much cleaner document. It's something that really stands out to me now when I see click here in documents. The other thing we want to try to do as well is put the hyperlink towards the end of a sentence. So learn more about Canada, so that underlined link would go to the website, Canada's website, rather than click here to learn more about Canada. Another thing to think about in terms of operability is the reading order of slides. So in a Google Doc, it's not really an issue because it's going to start at the top of the document and work its way down. So you can put a picture in afterwards, and it's going to hold its place in that document. But on slides, the thing that's a little bit different and can be a little bit confusing is that the order in which you like copy and paste a picture in, or maybe add a text box, determines how it's read by a screen reader. So I'm just going to escape out of here for a second. And what I will show you is that when I hit tab, this is the order in which it's going to be read. So you can see it's going to highlight. So you see it jumped over here to these books when I wanted it to actually come to this computer first. So that was because I put the picture of the books in and then rearranged the order of them. So if I want this to read in a different way, I'm going to right click and go to order. And you can send items forwards and backwards on the slide to determine how they're going to be read. So now I just sent that one for, it's kind of opposite of what you would think to send things forwards or backwards. You might have to play with it a bit. But now I can go tab through that and I see that it's in the correct order. So if somebody was listening to this with their assistive tech, it would read the title first, it would read the main points, then it would read the alt text behind each of these images. Also in Google Docs, using the commenting and suggesting features that are built in are quite useful to use with a screen reader rather than putting comments right in the document. So that's just something to think about. I'm sure a lot of people use them anyway, but just know that there's some really nice shortcuts for screen readers to navigate around in a Google Doc in that way. So the U in the POUR acronym stands for understandable. So we want to create kind of a natural, intuitive experience when students are reading our documents or looking at our slides or our website. So making sure we're providing clear directions. Consistency is important, making sure that slides and pages are laid out in the same way, that your formatting isn't changing from page to page. Using plain language is important, especially if you're, sending documents home, that sort of thing. You want to make sure that it can be understood by, as many people as possible. And there is some guidance out there around, writing for plain language standards. That may not be as applicable if you're creating materials to use, academic materials that need to be of a certain, vocabulary and that sort of thing. And then also another setting in docs and slides is identifying the language that's being used in the document, which can be really helpful for, just even spell checking, but other features as well. So I mentioned this already in terms of making manual changes. Using the headings really helps to keep things standard across your document. So when you apply a heading, it's going to be the same font, the same size across every heading. So you could go in and, highlight what you think are headings and make them all the same size manually and maybe bold them or underline them. But then there may be inconsistencies throughout your document. So using the headings is helpful. And also avoid using a variety of fonts in one document. It can be a bit much for some people visually. Making sure that your file name is clear and understandable is important as well. So if it's something that you're sharing with students or is getting uploaded to Google Classroom, trying to make it as easy for them to find as possible. But also just thinking about if somebody is trying to navigate that maybe has low vision, if it's depending on the title of it, it could make it easier or harder for them to find. And again, like I mentioned, setting the language of the document. So just going into file and setting the language is an important step. So some of you may be aware as well about the option to translate a Google Doc, but I did put the link in here as well. And I'm just going to switch back over to my little sample document. So if you're in a document, you can go to Tools and Translate. It'll ask you for the new title, so I could call it, whatever I wanted to. And maybe I want to translate it into Arabic. And when I click Translate, it will keep my original document, but it will also give me what it calls a translated copy of it with the Arabic writing in there. And then that's something, if you're using Read and Write for Google Chrome, that can be read aloud as well. So lots of tools that kind of cross over between, language supports as well as the accessibility piece. So the last letter in the POUR acronym is robust. So we want to just make sure that our documents are compatible with lots of different assistive tech. And we're going to perform accessibility checks. And the big thing really is testing it for accessibility with people who use AT, because they are the first voice users of the technology, and they're going to pick up on things that you may not be aware of. People will ask me to test things out for them, and I'll say, I can certainly do some basic things. I have a program, actually, I'll get to that in 1 second. There we go. NVDA is a free screen reader. If you're able to download things onto your device, it is a Windows option, and I downloaded that, so I do play around with that a little bit if there's something that I need to check, but ultimately, users of AT are going to give you the best result. But there are a few other options here that are quite neat. So Grackle is one that you can, it's an add-on for Google Docs and Slides. I'll show you that in a second. And then there's also Wave for web accessibility, so you can use that with any website. It is a little more technical, whereas Grackle is kind of a nice layout. And then I did want to give a link here to Word and PowerPoint accessibility checklists. So I focused today on Google Docs, but knowing that some of you would be using Word and PowerPoint in various ways. There's a lot of crossover, but there are some specific things to Word and PowerPoint. They do have built-in accessibility checkers, which is a nice sort of feature over and above what Google does offer. So I'm going to go back to my grocery list here for a second. So under extensions, you'll see Grackle Docs. And if I launch that, it's going to bring up this box on the right-hand side. And it'll do a little analysis of my document. And it will tell me what I need to fix. So it tells me I've got a document title. I specified the language. I left off the alt text on purpose just so you could see how that noted that I didn't have that behind this picture of Swiss cheese. Whoops. So this is where I would write that in and hit OK. And if I did a recheck, that should tell me that this document is good to go. So it's a simple one that you can use to check in Docs and Slides. It'll give you little reminders here if there are things that you need to fix. And it's a little more user-friendly than the other one that is there, the 1 second here, the Wave, which is a little more technical. So something to keep in mind, PDFs are great, but they're also problematic at times because the formatting does not always save properly, especially from a Google Doc to PDF. So what you want to be careful about, like if you've added headings, you do need to make sure that you download it as a PDF rather than going to print and then save PDF. And even then, you still need to check it. I've done this with documents, and it's still sometimes when I test it out, it doesn't work well. If you have access to Microsoft Word, sometimes it's beneficial to save it as a Microsoft Word document, and then you can run the accessibility checker. And the process to go to PDF that way is a little more handy. So depending on what you're trying to do with the document, maybe you're better off to share it with view-only access rather than creating a PDF out of it. There's a whole program out there called InDesign that people work with PDFs to try to, remediate them and make them accessible, but there can be, there's a lot of steps to that. Okay, so we are right on time. So I have just a short little activity, and it is a sample Google Doc. So what I'm going to do is just going to put the link to it in the chat, and it will force you to make a copy. And what you can do in that copy is just practice with some of the accessibility things that I showed you today. I tried to make it kind of as inaccessible and hard to look at as possible. So just to give you an opportunity to go in and play around with those things. And we'll just take a couple minutes to do that. And we'll come back together and just have a quick chat about it before we wrap up. So how about I give maybe just about 3 minutes to have a look at that so that we have time to wrap up before 4 o'clock. All right. Did anybody want to share what they did to their document to make it a little more accessible? And you could share your screen if you want, or you could just write it in the chat or raise your hand and give a suggestion. I'm just going to bring up the sample. Yeah, Allison.
I can share what I did if you can remind me how to share my screen here.
Down. I'm just wondering if you have the option to share now that I say that. Down on the bottom, there's I'll stop sharing mine.
There we go.
There we go.
I got it. Let's see. Okay. Can you see that?
Yep. Awesome.
Okay, so I just changed the title to a 14 size 14 font. I did add in the alt text, but I don't see the little. Does it say? I don't see where it says alt text on this.
Just you just right click on the photo and.
Oops. Okay.
There you go.
So it should be in there, yeah.
Awesome.
And then I did change the rest of the font to a size 12, and I added the links in.
Great.
Peggy's Cove. I took out the click here.
Looks wonderful.
I think that's about it. Oh, and left aligned everything.
Awesome. It looks much better than the one that I gave you to to play with. That's great. Thanks for sharing, Allison. Appreciate that. All right, let's go back and we'll do a little wrap up. So I just want to do that little demonstration just to show you, it is quick and easy to make some simple changes to your documents that can make them a lot more user-friendly. On the point about remediation, so we do get lots of materials that we find online or that are sent out to us, and sometimes they're in a format that isn't accessible. So we do have to do some remediation to create an accessible version. So the process of OCR scanning, so that stands for optical character resolution, that extracts text from documents or camera images or PDF that maybe someone took with their phone. Once it's been, you can do that within Google as well. But one nice thing, you can, there's some instructions here within Google Drive for how you can do that process. But what's been really helpful, if you're not familiar with Orbit Note, which is the PDF version of working with the read and write tools, it does prompt you now to scan text if it's recognizing it as an image and not text. So once you open up a PDF, it'll prompt you, you click on it, and then you can use all your speech to text features, your dictionaries, your translator, whatever it might be. So there's a link there to an article and a little video about how to do that. So it's great that we have that tool now that's kind of built in for that purpose. Okay, that brings us to the end of the slideshow and presentation.